When someone has dementia, and Gary was unable to communicate or really reason for a number of years, or if someone has a mental illness, or maybe someone just has less capacity to take in the Word of God and obey the Lord in that way, how is that verse fulfilled for someone who's really unable to apply the Word to their heart anymore?
I think you have to understand the question this way. The assumption is that the process of sanctification is related to a functioning human capacity. We would not assume that a child would be able to take in the Word of God with a full understanding, make significant application of that truth, discern its implications. We wouldn't expect a young child to do that. The same would be true of someone who was to some degree limited mentally, maybe by a low IQ or maybe by an accident or maybe by some kind of an illness. So we don't want to say that spiritual growth is only for the super smart people, but it assumes that there is a functioning mind, that there is the ability to think on these things. Because that's exactly what the Apostle Paul says. If there's any virtue, any praise, think on these things. And the Bible also says that you are renewed by your mind, in your mind. You come to the knowledge of the truth and the renewing of your mind. So the actual mind plays a very important role in the process of sanctification. If there is an incapacitation of that mind, obviously the process of sanctification is affected by that. It is basically put on hold at that particular point, and we can't assume that there will be spiritual things happening without the ability to process divine truth, see its implications, and even live in its application. That does not mean that God has abandoned the person. That does not mean that God is not watching over, caring for, sustaining, and even comforting that person. While that may not be articulated by someone who's incapacitated like that, but what that verse essentially is saying is just looking at life in general as we get older and our outer man, our human body, decays. While the human body is going downhill, the spiritual life should be going uphill. But it assumes the functioning of the mind. And when that doesn't happen, then you have to deal with people the way you would deal with a child, someone without the full capacity. A good illustration of it is the great influence in my life was a man named Dr. Charles Feinberg. Dr. Feinberg, I've told you about him in the past. He was my mentor and my teacher in seminary, and he was extremely brilliant. He knew about 30 languages, and he had studied to be a rabbi and was converted to Christ and wrote many books and knew the Bible, and he was the most profound theological mind that I ever came across, just an astonishing man. He, at the end of his life, was struck with dementia also, and he thought he was an unconverted Jew. He had been an unconverted Jew, but he had become a believer in Jesus Christ and the president of a seminary, training men and writing books on, particularly on messianic portions of the Old Testament. They said that while he was in whatever facility he was in at the end of his life, he didn't remember that he was a Christian, but he kept calling faculty meetings like he was still the head of a seminary. So all we can say about that is that he was as much in the care of Christ in those hours when he lost the ability to reason as ever he was when he had his complete reason intact. His salvation was not tied to how his brain functioned. His salvation was tied to the grace and the goodness of God, and it was manifest in the time that he was reasonable. And when that went away, it didn't affect that salvation, although it certainly put the process of sanctification on hold. But they came to an abrupt ending in the case of Gary when he went into the presence of the Lord and then he was known as he was known, right? Wonderful question.